He was the kind of man people didn't run to. They stepped aside for him. Cold, sharp, untouchable. That's how Alexander Steele had survived the last decade. One heartbreak, one betrayal, and he shut the door on anything that felt too warm, too messy, too human. But that morning, everything cracked open. He was walking out of the elevator, phone in one hand, heart walled up as always, when he heard the tiniest voice echo through the lobby. "Daddy?" His entire body froze. The phone slipped from his fingers. Time stopped. And before anyone could react, a little girl, barefoot, with wild curls and teary eyes, came running across the marble floor like her life depended on it. Straight to him. Everyone stared. And he just stood there, because somehow in that child's eyes he saw a ghost of something he didn't even know he'd lost. A past he never expected. A future he never planned. A love that would rewrite everything. And upstairs, watching from the office window, his grandmother, the fierce, elegant matriarch of the Steel Empire, was already smiling through tears. Because for the first time in years, there was hope. Because finally, there was an heir. If this story touches your heart already, you're not alone. Get ready for a journey full of heartbreak, hidden truths, second chances, and the kind of love that never lets go. Please like, comment below, and subscribe so you never miss the stories that remind us how family finds us, even when we least expect it. The storm had been whispering since dawn. Not loud, not angry, just persistent. Like the sky was mourning something the world had forgotten. Rain misted down in cold sheets, painting the city in shades of silver and gray. Beneath the weight of the clouds, the towering structure of Steel Enterprises glistened like a kingdom, made of glass and steel, impenetrable to the chaos of the streets below. People came and went, rushing with umbrellas and coffee cups, shoulders hunched against the cold. No one noticed the little girl standing across the street. She had been there for almost an hour now, tiny still and soaked to the bone. Her thin lavender sweater clung to her small frame, the cuffs stained with grime. Her shoes, both too big and too thin for the weather, squished when she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. In her hands she clutched a stuffed bunny with one eye missing, and the ear sewn back on with mismatched thread. The little girl didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stared at the building. Inside the massive lobby of Steel Enterprises, the world moved like clockwork. High heels tapped against marble floors, elevator doors slid open with soft pings, and the scent of espresso drifted from the corner cafe. Everything was orderly, clean, controlled. Alexander Steele liked it that way. He stepped out of the elevator with the precision of a man whose life was scheduled to the second. Tall, broad-shouldered, and sharply dressed in a navy suit, he exuded power the way some people exuded warmth, naturally, effortlessly. But unlike warmth, power was something he cultivated, deliberately, ruthlessly. His assistant, Morgan, trotted beside him, rattling off updates about stock movement and a potential acquisition in Tokyo. He nodded once, distracted, his gaze flickering to the glass doors as a gust of wind pressed against them. For a split second, he thought he saw something. A flash of color. Purple. Wet hair. So, a child? He frowned, but the moment passed. "Reschedule the investor call to tomorrow," he said curtly. "And tell Danvers I want the fiscal report on my desk before noon." Morgan scribbled frantically into her digital notepad. "Of course, sir." "And the Bennett Foundation Gala?" "Not going," he interrupted. "Send flowers." She hesitated. "Your grandmother was hoping—" I said no. He stepped into the elevator again, this time heading for his private office on the top floor. The doors closed with a whisper, sealing him off from the world below. But outside, the little girl was still watching. She didn't know his name, not really, but she knew the building. The one with the silver crown on top, Mommy had said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a damp photograph. The edges were curled and smudged, the ink slightly faded. A man stood in the center, tall, in a dark suit, looking more tired than happy. Behind him, the same building she was staring at now. "This is him," her mother had whispered once, late at night, when she thought the little girl was asleep. "This is the man who ruined everything." The girl didn't understand that part. All she knew was that something inside her said, "Find him." She didn't want to be outside anymore. She was hungry, cold. And the woman who brought her here, the neighbor, with too many bags and a short temper, had said she'd be back in 10 minutes. That was almost 2 hours ago. The little girl looked up at the sky. "Bunny," she whispered, squeezing her toy tightly. "What if he's not here?" The bunny didn't answer. But her feet moved anyway, across the street, past honking horns and puddles, toward the silver doors. Inside, a receptionist looked up as the doors parted, and blinked. A soaking wet child stood there alone. She looked so out of place in the polished world of executives and power suits that for a moment no one moved. Then the little girl took a shaky breath and stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said softly, voice quivering but clear. "Can you help me find my... Her lips trembled. She wasn't sure what to call him. Not yet. The receptionist came around the desk, crouching low. "Sweetheart, are you lost? Where's your mommy?" The girl shook her head. "She's gone, but he's in here. I know it. I just have to find him." The receptionist frowned, concerned. "Who, honey? What's his name?" She pulled out the photograph and held it up with trembling fingers. The woman took it carefully and froze. Because the man in the photo was Alexander Steele. Jessica had seen countless people come through the lobby of Steele Enterprises, each one more important than the last. CEOs, investors, business magnates, they all passed through the grand marble floors of the building with a sense of urgency, a certain coldness in their eyes, as if they were all too focused on the future to spare a glance at what might be right in front of them. But the little girl standing before her was different. Hope. The name alone spoke volumes, more than Jessica cared to admit. Hope, huh? A name full of promise, full of possibility, but also full of vulnerability. The girl's big eyes, damp with remnants of rain, stared up at her in silence, clutching a photo in her small hands. It was a photo of Alexander Steele. There was no mistaking it. Even though the photo was faded, with edges slightly curled from age, the features were unmistakable. His sharp jawline, his strong nose, his icy blue eyes that seemed to pierce through the lens of the camera. It was him, no question about it. Jessica's stomach churned. She couldn't explain why, but something about this little girl's presence felt wrong. But how could that be? She was just a child. A small child holding a picture of a man who, in the world of Steele Enterprises, was more legend than reality. But there was something else, the way the girl spoke. "Mommy said I'd find him here." Her voice was too soft, too innocent, and yet there was something almost prophetic in the way she said it. Jessica shook her head, trying to clear the thoughts racing in her mind. She couldn't think like this. There was no way the child could be connected to Alexander Steele. He wasn't the kind of man who had children outside of his carefully curated world. Was he? "Sweetheart, where did you get this picture?" Jessica asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The girl, Hope, didn't answer right away. Instead, she simply looked up at Jessica, her big eyes wide with a mixture of hope and hesitation. It was as if she was waiting for the world to understand her, to make sense of the connection she seemed to believe was already clear. "My mommy had it," Hope finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She said you'd help me find him." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. "Who is your mommy?" Hope didn't answer directly, instead staring at the receptionist with a look that seemed to pierce through her, as if trying to gauge how much Jessica understood. After a moment, she spoke again, quieter this time. "Mommy said you'd know. She said the man in the picture is my daddy." Jessica blinked, taken aback. She felt her grip on the desk tighten involuntarily. The room felt suddenly too small, too confined. Your daddy?" Hope nodded, clutching the picture tighter to her chest, her small fingers trembling slightly. "She said I'd find him here. She said it's his building, the one with the crown." Jessica's mind reeled. The building with the crown. The Steel Enterprises headquarters was often described in the press as a symbol of power, of wealth. It was an architectural marvel, towering above the city skyline, its shape resembling a crown, just as Hope had described. But this was ridiculous. There was no way Alexander Steele, one of the most high-profile men in the city, had a child he didn't know about. Not with the way he ran his life, not with the way he kept everything so tightly under control. "Sweetheart, I need you to stay here for a moment," Jessica said, her voice shaky as she took a step back. "Let me go make a call." The girl nodded, still holding the picture like it was the most precious thing in the world. Jessica couldn't tear her eyes away from Hope as she picked up the phone. She dialed the top floor, her fingers shaking as she pressed the buttons. When the phone picked up, Morgan's calm voice answered. "Morgan speaking." "Morgan," Jessica said quickly. "I think you need to come down here." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What's wrong, Jessica?" There's a child. She's here with a photograph of Mr. Steele. She says he's her father. She says her mother showed her this photo and told her to come here to find him." Another silence. Then Morgan's voice, though still professional, had a new edge to it. "I'll be down in a minute." Jessica hung up the phone, not sure what to think anymore. She glanced at Hope again, who was still standing by the desk, clutching the picture, her expression a mixture of confusion and determination. She was so small, yet the weight of her words felt too heavy for her tiny frame. A few minutes later, Morgan arrived. She was dressed impeccably as usual, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the lobby. When she saw Hope, her expression faltered for just a moment before she masked it with professionalism. "Jessica, what's going on?" Morgan asked, her gaze flicking from Jessica to Hope. The receptionist hesitated for a moment before handing Morgan the photo. Morgan's breath caught when she saw it. The photo was of Alexander Steele, no mistaking that. But it wasn't just any picture. It was an old one, and the child holding it. There was no doubt in Morgan's mind that this was no coincidence. Jessica watched as Morgan processed the situation. "I think you need to take a closer look," Jessica said quietly. Morgan knelt down in front of Hope, her gaze softening. "Where did you get this, sweetheart?" Hope looked up at her, her eyes filled with something like silent desperation. "Mommy said to give it to him. She said he's my daddy." Morgan blinked, the weight of the words slowly sinking in. Her mind raced. This couldn't be real, could it? Alexander Steele, cold, calculating. Ruthless Alexander Steele. A father? The man had always been so focused on building his empire that the idea of him having a child was unthinkable. Yet here was this girl standing in front of them, insisting that he was her father. "Sweetie," Morgan said gently, her voice filled with a mix of confusion and sympathy. "Where's your mommy?" Hope's lower lip quivered as she shook her head. She's gone. Mommy's gone. The word struck Morgan like a punch to the gut. The child's voice was small, almost fragile, as though speaking about her mother was too much. Gone? Morgan asked softly. Hope nodded, her eyes filling with unshed tears. She said I was supposed to find him. Morgan's heart ached for the little girl. She didn't know what to make of the situation. But one thing was painfully clear. Hope needed someone. She needed a family. We'll take you upstairs, Morgan said after a long moment of silence. We'll get you warm, okay? Hope's face lit up with hope. Can we see him? Morgan didn't know how to answer that. There were too many unanswered questions, too many unknowns, but she couldn't turn the little girl away. As they made their way toward the elevator, Hope continued to ask questions, her small voice carrying a sense of urgency. Will he be mad? Will he be angry at me? Morgan's chest tightened, her mind racing. She had no answers, and how could she? She wasn't prepared for this. None of them were. I don't think he'll be mad, sweetie, Morgan said, her voice reassuring. But let's just wait and see, okay? The elevator ride seemed to take forever. When the doors finally opened on the top floor, Morgan stepped out first, guiding Hope toward Alexander's office. The building seemed to swallow them up as they walked down the gleaming corridors, each step echoing in the quiet, empty hall. As they approached his office, the tension was palpable. Morgan hesitated before knocking. The door opened, and there he was, Alexander Steele, the man who had built an empire from nothing, the man who had always been so certain of everything, now standing face to face with the one thing he couldn't control. Hope stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. Are you my daddy? The words hung in the air, and for a moment time seemed to freeze. Alexander's eyes flickered between the child and the photo in her hand. His expression, usually so calm and controlled, faltered for just a split second. I don't have a child, he said, his voice cold, though the tremor in it betrayed his uncertainty. Hope didn't back down. Yes, you do. You're my daddy. Morgan watched the scene unfold in front of her, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't just a coincidence. Something bigger was at play here. Finally, Alexander cleared his throat, his voice regaining its usual icy tone. This is impossible. I don't know who you are, and I don't have a child. But Hope wasn't deterred. I have a brother. His name is Matthew. He's sick. Mommy said you could help him. The mention of Matthew sent a jolt through Alexander. The name was too familiar. Matthew. It was a name he had buried long ago, a name that had been part of a life he had tried to forget. The silence between them was thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice low. Matthew? Hope nodded. Mommy said you were the only one who could help him. And just like that, everything Alexander thought he knew about his life began to unravel. The room was eerily quiet after Hope's words hung in the air. Alexander Steele, the empire-building CEO known for his calculated decisions, stood frozen, staring at the child who had just claimed that he was her father. His mind spun, processing the impossible words, and yet something in his chest clenched, a painful, inexplicable feeling that he couldn't shake. Hope stood before him, small and fragile, her eyes filled with a kind of silent strength. She wasn't like the children he'd seen in the corporate world, privileged, distant, self-assured. No, she was a child, lost in a world far too big for her, clutching onto a belief that, in the deepest part of Alexander's mind, made no sense. I don't have a child, Alexander repeated. his voice sounding less sure this time, a crack forming in his usual steely demeanor. But Hope didn't falter. Her gaze remained locked with his, unwavering. "Mommy said you were my daddy. She said you could help us." His mind flashed back to the past, to the years he had buried. The careless affair with a woman whose face he couldn't even recall. Those were days he thought had no consequences. Days he'd erased from his memory, locked away in a part of himself he didn't dare visit. It was easier that way. But now, standing in front of him, was the consequence of that mistake. This little girl, no more than 5 or 6, was staring at him with such certainty, her small body trembling with the weight of the truth she believed to be real. I don't know what you're talking about," Alexander said, taking a step back. His eyes darted to Morgan, who had been silent all this time, standing in the corner of the room, watching the interaction unfold with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Morgan stepped forward slowly, her gaze never leaving the child. "Alex, I think we need to consider the possibility that she's telling the truth." Alexander's gaze shot to her. "You're saying I have a child I didn't know about?" Morgan's expression softened, but her voice remained firm. "We don't know the full story yet, but it's not impossible." The word impossible lingered in the air between them, like a heavy fog that refused to lift. Alexander's hand ran through his hair, his mind racing through a maze of possibilities. He couldn't deny the resemblance to the photograph. The same strong jaw, the same eyes. Was it possible? Could this child truly be his? He looked down at Hope again, who was holding on to the picture of him with a death grip. Her eyes were wide, innocent, and yet there was something unsettling in them. She was waiting for him as if she had always known this moment would come. "How old are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Hope tilted her head slightly, her brows furrowing. "I'm 5, she answered matter-of-factly. 5. That meant 5 years ago. The timeline was impossible to ignore. 5 years ago, he had been in a brief affair that had ended as quickly as it started. He hadn't even known the woman's last name, let alone anything about her life afterward. But this child? This little girl standing before him with her big, tear-filled eyes and the quiet strength that seemed far beyond her years was his blood. There was no denying it now. The resemblance was undeniable. "I need answers," Alexander said suddenly, his voice hardening again, as if to shut out the vulnerability that had crept in. "I need to know who your mother is." Hope's face faltered for just a second before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's gone," she said softly, her words cutting through the air like a knife. The sudden emptiness in her tone sent a shiver down Alexander's spine. The quiet resignation of a child who had lost so much. "Gone?" Alexander repeated, unable to mask the concern in his voice. "What do you mean? Where is she?" Hope's small face tightened, her brows furrowing deeply. She hugged the picture of Alexander to her chest, looking down at it with a wistful expression. "She left," Hope whispered. She said you were the only one who could help." The words, so simple yet so heavy, hit Alexander like a slap. The woman had left Hope. And in that moment, Alexander's chest tightened with something between anger and regret. How could she have left this little girl? Had she been forced to make that decision? Had she been desperate? "I'm sorry," Hope said suddenly, her small voice breaking through his thoughts. "I didn't mean to upset you." "No, it's not your fault," Alexander murmured, crouching down to her level. He took a deep breath, struggling to contain the emotions swirling inside him. "You didn't do anything wrong. It's just, I wasn't expecting this." Hope looked at him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Will you help us?" Alexander's chest tightened again at the question, the weight of it settling on him like a mountain. Would he help them? What did that even mean? The truth was, he didn't know how. He was a man who thrived on control, who surrounded himself with people who anticipated his every need. But this child was an unknown. She was a puzzle he couldn't solve, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt helpless. Before he could respond, Morgan spoke up. "We need to take a step back and think this through. Let's get more information. This isn't something we can just rush into." Alexander straightened up, his back stiffening as he looked at Morgan. "I don't care about rushing. I want answers. I need to know who her mother is." Morgan nodded. "We will. But first, let's sit down and figure out what we do next." The room was heavy with tension as they sat down. Hope was seated next to Alexander, who still couldn't quite process the full extent of what had just happened. He was a man of control, a man who built his empire with calculated precision. But here, in front of him, was a mystery that he couldn't solve, no matter how much he tried to rationalize it. Hope stared up at him, her eyes filled with trust, but also uncertainty. She was so young, so fragile. How had she ended up here, standing in his office with no one to take care of her? Who was her mother, and why had she sent her to Alexander after all this time? "Where's your mother now?" Alexander asked, his voice breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Hope's face darkened for a moment, her small hands clutching the photo tightly. "She's gone," she said softly. "She left us. She said you were the only one who could help." Alexander swallowed hard. He wasn't ready for this. Wasn't ready for the implications of the words Hope had just said. He wasn't prepared to face the consequences of a past he had buried. But now it seemed like the past had come crashing into his present, and there was no way out. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breathing, to gain control over the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. There was no way to go back. There was no way to erase the mistake he had made 5 years ago. And now a child was standing in front of him, asking for something he had no idea how to give. "Alex," Morgan's voice broke through his thoughts once again, bringing him back to reality. "We have to find out more. This isn't just about you. This is about her future. And we need to know everything." He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. There was a certain softness in her eyes now, but it was also filled with determination. Morgan was right. He had to find out more. But the one thing that had become painfully clear to him was that this was no longer just about his empire, his business. This was about a child who might have been his own. "I'll help you," he said finally, the words heavy as if spoken under the weight of an enormous responsibility. He looked down at Hope, who was watching him with wide, expectant eyes. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Steele felt like he had no idea what he was doing. If you have listened to this point, it means you are enjoying the story. Please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to this channel. It motivates us to do more. Thank you. Let's head back to the story. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on Alexander Steele's chest as he stood in his office, his mind swirling with thoughts he could neither control nor quiet. Hope, the child he had never known existed, sat quietly beside him, her small hand still clutching the photo of him that had brought her to his doorstep. She hadn't spoken much since their exchange, only glancing at him, now and then with those wide, searching eyes, waiting for him to offer something, anything that would reassure her. And yet, Alexander had nothing to give. He was a man who had built his empire with iron will, precision, and an unyielding belief in logic. But logic couldn't help him now. What was he supposed to do? How could he undo the past, a past that now seemed to haunt him in the form of a little girl who was supposed to be his daughter? His mind screamed in disbelief, and yet the reality of the situation settled like a stone in his stomach. "Have you told anyone else?" Alexander asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Hope shook her head, her hair falling across her face, partially obscuring her eyes. "No," she whispered. "Just Mommy and you." Alexander glanced at Morgan, who had been quiet during the exchange, observing the situation with a mixture of concern and curiosity. She had known Alexander for years, and even now she remained composed as ever, a stabilizing presence in the chaos of his thoughts. But even Morgan couldn't hide the curiosity in her gaze. She wanted to know more. She needed answers as much as he did. "We need to find out who her mother is," Morgan said, her voice filled with quiet urgency. "We can't just leave it at this." "Of course," Alexander agreed. His voice strained as he leaned forward, placing his elbows on the polished surface of his desk. I don't know where to start. It's been 5 years. What if she's already moved on? What if this is just some crazy mistake?" But as soon as the words left his lips, Alexander knew they were empty. He had seen the photo Hope was clutching with such care. It was one of the few pictures he kept, an old photograph taken years ago during a trip he had barely remembered. The memory was fuzzy, like trying to recall a dream that slipped through his fingers the moment you woke up. But Hope was in that picture. He knew it. He could feel it in the depths of his gut. "I don't think this is a mistake," Morgan said gently, her voice breaking through his spiraling thoughts. "She looks like you, Alex. That photo, it's proof. And if we're being honest, you're the only person who can help her now." The words stung more than Alexander cared to admit. He had never wanted children, had never dreamed of being a father. He had been too focused on his career, on his business, on his empire. But now, faced with a reality he hadn't been prepared for, the weight of responsibility began to settle in his bones. Hope looked up at him, her eyes wide with trust, yet tinged with something else. Was it hope or desperation? Alexander swallowed hard and his throat dry. He had to make a decision. There was no going back. "We'll find your mother," he promised, though the words felt hollow. What did he really know about the woman who had left Hope all those years ago? Was she dead, as Hope had suggested? Or had she simply abandoned her daughter, leaving her to fend for herself? Suddenly his mind flashed back to the woman he had shared that brief, passionate affair with. Her name, her face, everything about her had been a blur. She had appeared and disappeared from his life in the blink of an eye, like a shadow that had never fully taken form. He had never asked her about her past, about her life. He had never cared enough to find out. But now her name, her existence, were a ghost that haunted him. The reality of it all was too much to process. "Alex," Morgan spoke again, this time with a softer tone. "We'll handle this, okay? But you need to talk to Hope. She's here, and she's waiting for answers." The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thick with the weight of Morgan's words. She was right. He couldn't avoid this. He couldn't just push it aside as he had done with so many things in the past. This was real. Hope was real. She was standing in front of him, and she needed him. "Hey," he said, turning to the little girl beside him. She looked up at him with those same searching eyes, as if she were waiting for him to pull some kind of miracle out of thin air. The thought of making any promises was terrifying, but Alexander couldn't bring himself to disappoint her. "I know this is a lot," he began, his voice low and hesitant. "But I'm going to help you. I'll find your mother, and we'll figure this out. Okay?" Hope nodded slowly, her lips curving into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You will?" she asked, as if she were testing him, unsure whether to believe the words coming from his mouth. "I will," he confirmed, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his mind. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of their exchange. Hope's quiet trust in him was almost unbearable. She had no one else, no family, no mother to guide her. She had walked into his life without warning, and now Alexander found himself bound to her, whether he was ready for it or not. Morgan's voice broke the silence again, soft and measured. "I'll get on the phone with our investigators. We'll start with what we know, and Alex, be careful. If this woman is connected to you, there may be more to this than just a child appearing out of nowhere." "Right," Alexander replied, though his thoughts were elsewhere. "I'll look into it, but I need to meet with my lawyer first. We need to get the ball rolling on custody. If we're going to help her, we need to make sure she's protected." Morgan gave him a small nod. "I'll take care of the rest. Just don't lose yourself in this. You've got a lot on your plate." Alexander met her gaze, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I won't," he muttered, though his heart wasn't sure he could keep that promise. With a sigh, Alexander turned his attention back to Hope, whose small hands were still clutched around the photo. She was looking at him with such earnestness, it was almost painful. There was something raw about the way she held on to him, as if he were the only thread tying her to anything she could understand. He was her father, whether he was ready to admit it or not. "Hope," he started, his voice quiet but firm. "We'll figure this out, okay? I'll get you the answers you need." The faintest hint of a smile appeared on Hope's face, but it quickly faded as she looked down at the photo again. Alexander felt a deep ache in his chest, a pull that he had never felt before. For the first time in his life, he realized that his empire wasn't the only thing he was responsible for. There was a child now, a child who was his. And whether he was ready or not, he was about to have a daughter. Certainly. Here is Chapter 4, split into Part 1 and Part 2, with each part approximately 2,100 words. Let's start with Part 1, Chapter 4, Part 1, The Secret Unveiled. The sound of footsteps echoed through the sleek hallways of the Steel Corporation's headquarters, each step deliberate, yet echoing with uncertainty. Alexander Steele had never felt more out of place in his own building. The weight of his new responsibility, of hope, loomed over him like a cloud. Despite the busy atmosphere of his office, despite the team members moving quickly and the constant hum of productivity, Alexander felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. He had been up all night, his mind whirling with thoughts of the little girl who now called him father. His world had been turned upside down in a matter of hours. One moment, he had been the successful CEO, the man everyone admired for his drive and ambition. The next, he was a father, a role he had never imagined himself in. But here he was, the undeniable truth standing before him in the form of Hope, the child whose life had been tangled with his own in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. He had decided to start with the basics, taking the first necessary steps to find out who her mother was, but his mind kept circling back to one haunting question. Why now? He reached his office, his usual sanctuary, only to find Morgan standing by the window staring out at the city below. She turned when she heard the door open, her expression unreadable. "Alex," Morgan greeted, her tone calm but knowing. "We need to talk." Alexander stepped inside and shut the door behind him, locking it for privacy. "I know," he replied, his voice weary. "I've been thinking about it all night. We need answers and fast." Morgan nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I've already made some calls. We got some information on the woman who might be Hope's mother. Alexander's heart skipped a beat. Could it be that easy? Tell me everything, he urged, walking over to his desk and sitting down, bracing himself for whatever Morgan had uncovered. Morgan didn't sit down. Instead, she remained standing, her hands clasped in front of her as she spoke. Her name is Eliza Monroe, Morgan began. The words cold but matter-of-fact. She was a successful entrepreneur at one point, but about 6 years ago she disappeared from the public eye. I've been in touch with a few of her old colleagues. According to them, she was going through some personal issues, depression, some family problems, but she never mentioned anything about a child. Alexander's chest tightened as he absorbed the information. Eliza Monroe. The name didn't immediately ring a bell, but then again, Alexander had never been someone to focus on women beyond a short affair. If she was tied to Hope in some way, then it was a part of his past that had remained hidden. I've also found some financial discrepancies, Morgan continued. She was wealthy, but she had some questionable dealings toward the end of her career. No one knows for sure what happened to her. The last known contact with her was just over 5 years ago. A sudden flash of memory hit Alexander. A brief meeting with a woman who seemed to be nothing more than a fleeting encounter in the blur of his business-driven life. He had been reckless, carefree, and perhaps a bit too indulgent in his youth. But now he wondered if that night had set everything in motion, a chain of events that had led to this moment. This doesn't make sense, he muttered to himself. If Hope is truly her daughter, why would Eliza just vanish like that? And why wouldn't she try to reach out? Morgan crossed the room and sat across from him, leaning forward. That's what we need to find out, but Alex, there's one more thing. Alexander looked up, sensing the change in her tone. It was serious. What is it? He asked, his voice sharper now. Morgan hesitated before continuing, as though weighing the consequences of her next words. We dug into her past a bit more. There's a chance she may be connected to someone from your past, someone who could be involved in the situation. The blood drained from Alexander's face. Who? Who? He demanded, his voice trembling slightly. Morgan leaned back in her chair. A man named Gregory Harrow, a former business associate of yours. A dark shadow crossed Alexander's face at the mention of Harrow's name. Gregory Harrow. The man had been an opportunistic, power-hungry businessman who had once tried to get into a partnership with Steel Corporation. However, Harrow's reputation was marred by rumors of shady dealings and criminal activity, which ultimately led to their severed ties. Gregory Harrow, Alexander's voice was cold. What does he have to do with this? I'm not sure yet, Morgan replied, but there are some old rumors about him being involved with women on the side. If Eliza Monroe was one of them, well, it changes everything. Alexander sat back in his chair, his mind racing. The connections were dizzying. Harrow had always been dangerous, ruthless in his pursuit of power and influence. If there was any truth to the rumors, it was possible that Hope's birth was the result of a short-lived affair, one Alexander had no knowledge of. Could it be that Harrow had been involved with Eliza Monroe? The possibilities were terrifying. I want you to dig deeper, Alexander said, his voice determined. Find out everything about Harrow, and get me everything you can on Eliza Monroe. We need answers. I need answers. Morgan nodded. I'll get on it right away. But Alex, I have to warn you. If Harrow is involved, this could be much bigger than you think. I know, Alexander murmured. He stood up, his gaze fixed on the city skyline outside the window. The weight of his responsibility, the weight of Hope's existence, pressed down on him harder than ever. He had made a promise to the girl. He would find her mother, and he would uncover the truth. no matter how dark or complicated it might be. The following weeks were a blur for Alexander. His usual focus on business had been replaced by a constant swirl of uncertainty and suspicion. Every moment of every day was consumed by thoughts of Hope, her future, and the mystery of her mother. He couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play here, something that he had yet to uncover. Morgan had worked tirelessly to gather more information about Eliza Monroe, and the pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. "I've found something," Morgan said one afternoon as she walked into Alexander's office, holding a folder in her hands. Her expression was grave. "It's not good news." Alexander looked up from his desk, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" Morgan sat down across from him, placing the folder between them. "It's Eliza Monroe. She's dead." Alexander's heart dropped into his stomach. He hadn't expected this. "What?" he breathed. "How?" Morgan opened the folder, revealing a news article from several years ago detailing Eliza's tragic death. A car accident. It had happened on a dark stretch of road late at night, a collision with another vehicle. Eliza had died instantly, and the other driver had vanished without a trace. No one had known about Hope, and no one had come forward to claim her. I didn't know," Alexander murmured, staring at the article. "She's gone. But that means Hope." "Hope is an orphan," Morgan interrupted softly, her voice filled with sympathy. "She has no one. And that's why you need to step up, Alex. You need to be her father for her." Alexander stood up, pacing the room as he processed the news. The grief in his chest was overwhelming. He had already lost so much: his past, his choices, his opportunity to be there for Hope. Now it was too late to fix the mistakes of the past. Eliza Monroe was gone, and Hope's future rested in his hands. "Call our legal team," Alexander ordered, his voice sharp. "We're filing for custody. Now." Morgan nodded, standing to leave. "I'll handle it. But Alex, you should talk to Hope. She needs to know the truth." The truth. For the first time, Alexander realized that he didn't just need to find out who Hope's mother was. He needed to be the father Hope had never had. He needed to give her the family she had been deprived of, no matter what it took. The days leading up to the legal proceedings felt like a blur to Alexander Steele. Every moment, every decision, every thought seemed to be consumed by one thing: Hope. His heart ached for the little girl who had captured his soul without him even realizing it. She had been a mystery at first, a reminder of a past he wished he could forget. But now she was his daughter. He had been doing everything in his power to secure her future, to make sure she had a life full of love and stability. The legal team was moving quickly, pulling all the strings necessary to ensure the adoption was as smooth as possible. But that didn't ease the knot in Alexander's stomach. He wasn't just a businessman now, he was a father. A father who had never known his own child until the most unexpected of circumstances had thrust her into his life. And now, with the legal papers in place and the looming finality of everything, he had to face the most difficult part: telling Hope the truth. Hope had become a constant presence in his life over the last few days. She was an enigma, a whirlwind of questions, laughter, and wonder. She had the innocence of childhood, the kind of innocence that Alexander had almost forgotten in his fast-paced world of business deals and power struggles. Every time she ran into his arms, every time she called him Daddy, his heart both swelled with emotion and twisted with guilt. How had he missed this for so long? Alexander sat at the grand dining table in the Steele mansion, flipping through the documents before him. But his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't focus on anything else. Not the deal with the foreign investors, not the upcoming meeting with the board of directors, and certainly not the flashy expansion ideas he had in mind for the company. The only thing that mattered now was Hope. "Daddy?" The sweet, high-pitched voice startled him out of his thoughts, and Alexander looked up to see Hope standing in the doorway. She was holding a stuffed bear, her small face etched with curiosity. "Yes, sweetheart?" Alexander asked, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Where's Grandma?" Hope asked innocently, her eyes wide as she peered around the room. Alexander's smile faltered slightly at the mention of his grandmother. "She's probably in her study, sweetheart. I'm sure she's waiting for you," he said gently, trying to hide the apprehension in his voice. Hope nodded and turned to leave, but then stopped in her tracks. She turned back to him, her little face full of concern. "Daddy, are you sad?" she asked. Alexander's heart clenched at her words. The raw sincerity in her eyes melted him. He had always prided himself on being strong, on never letting anyone see his vulnerabilities, but Hope saw through all of that. "No, baby," he said softly. "I'm not sad. Just thinking, you know." Hope nodded slowly and then ran off, her tiny feet pattering down the hallway. But Alexander's mind was still locked on her words. "Are you sad?" How could he explain to her that the weight he was carrying wasn't sadness, it was guilt? Guilt for not being there when she needed him. Guilt for not being the father she deserved sooner. Guilt for the way his life had spiraled out of control. And only now, when things were so far beyond his reach, was he trying to fix it all. Hours later, as the sun began to set, Alexander stood outside on the grand balcony of his mansion, staring out at the horizon. He had just finished a meeting with the legal team, and the papers were nearly ready to be filed. Hope would officially be his daughter in the eyes of the law within days, but he wasn't sure how he would ever be able to feel fully ready. Everything about this process felt overwhelming. There were so many things he still didn't know about being a father, about raising a child, especially one who had experienced so much heartbreak already. He didn't know how to ease her fears. He didn't know how to make her feel like she was finally home. But one thing was clear. He would move mountains for her. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Alex?" a familiar voice said. He turned to see his grandmother, the woman who had always been his rock, walking towards him with a gentle smile on her face. His grandmother, Eleanor Steele, was a woman of commanding presence despite her years. Her silver hair was styled neatly, and her sharp features gave nothing away. But her eyes, those wise eyes, always seemed to pierce through the noise of the world and see the truth beneath. "Grandma," Alexander greeted her, his voice laced with the same respect he had always had for her. She smiled at him, her hands clasped in front of her. "I've been thinking about Hope," she said, her voice quiet but filled with certainty. "Of course you have," Alexander said, his expression softening. "She's everything now. The future." Well, Eleanor looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. "You know, Alex, I've waited my entire life for this. For a legacy. For a family." Alexander's eyes narrowed. He knew exactly what she was referring to. His grandmother had always been the backbone of the Steele family, holding everything together, including the empire that she had worked so hard to build. And now, with the arrival of Hope, it seemed that her dream was within reach. "I know, Grandma," Alexander said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "And I promise you, I'll make sure Hope is everything you ever hoped for. She deserves that." Eleanor smiled, a mixture of pride and something else that Alexander couldn't quite read. "You don't have to promise me anything, Alex," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "You've already done it. Hope has found her place in this family, and I can already see how much she means to you." Alexander stood silently for a moment, reflecting on her words. But then, just as quickly as the moment of peace had settled in, the door to the mansion burst open, and Hope came running toward them. She was grinning ear to ear, her arms outstretched as if she were about to leap into the air. "I found Grandma!" she shouted happily. Eleanor bent down to lift Hope in her arms, her eyes twinkling with love. "Of course you did, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft as she held the little girl close. "You always know where to find me." Hope giggled, her laughter filling the air, and in that moment, Alexander felt a shift in his heart. Everything he had been working toward, all of his struggles and questions, seemed to melt away in the presence of this tiny, precious girl. He had thought he could never be a father, that he was too lost in his own world of ambition and power. But Hope had broken down those walls without even realizing it. She had been his salvation. And now it was his turn to save her. As the evening wore on, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing in ways he couldn't control. There were still so many unanswered questions about Hope's past, about the true nature of her birth, and the dark figure who had haunted his life years ago, Gregory Harrow. But Alexander was no longer focused on the past. He had learned that no matter how hard he tried to outrun it, it would always catch up with him. The only thing that mattered now was the future. His future with Hope. His family. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow he would take the first official step to becoming the father Hope deserved. Ariadne sat beside Matthew, gently brushing his unruly hair with her fingers. The faint afternoon light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden patterns on the walls. It was the kind of quiet that felt like a fragile gift, peaceful, yes, but fleeting. Richard had just left the room to take a business call, reluctantly tearing himself away from the calm that had settled between his son and this mysterious beggar girl. "Do you ever wonder," Ariadne said softly, "why God lets people suffer?" Matthew didn't answer right away. He was staring at the sunlight as it touched the far wall, as though he could melt into it if he stared hard enough. "Every single day," he finally whispered. Ariadne nodded, understanding threading through her eyes. "Me too." She pulled out a crumpled note from her pocket. Matthew tilted his head to see. "It's a prayer," she said. "My mom wrote it. Back when we still had a home. She used to say it every night with me. I kept it, even after everything fell apart." Matthew looked at the paper like it was a relic. He didn't reach for it, but he didn't look away either. "When life breaks you," she read, "don't hide your wounds from God. Show him. He already sees them. Let him heal them, one by one." Silence. Then Matthew muttered, "What if some wounds can't be healed?" Ariadne looked directly into his eyes. "What if the wounds are the way healing begins?" Something shifted in Matthew's expression. It wasn't a smile, not quite. But his eyes didn't look as far away anymore. Later that night, Richard sat alone in his office, staring at a framed photograph of Matthew when he was 6. The boy was standing in a field, arms wide, laughing. That laugh, unfiltered joy. It had been years since he'd heard it. He tapped his desk absently, then picked up his phone. "Elijah," he said when the line connected. "She's doing something. I don't know what, but she's stirring something in Matthew." On the other end, Elijah's voice was calm. "And how does that make you feel?" Richard chuckled bitterly. "Like a man watching someone else give his son what he never could." "She's a seed," Elijah said. "You watered everything with money, control, and logic. Ariadne waters with tears, faith, and the raw honesty of someone who's had nothing to lose." Richard pinched the bridge of his nose. She told Matthew about her mother, about a prayer. He listened. "Elijah," Richard whispered. "What if she's right? What if something's changing?" "Then don't get in the way of the rain," Elijah said simply. "Let it fall. Let the garden bloom." The next morning, Matthew asked for something that shook the entire household. "I want to go outside," he said. It was the first time he'd requested anything of his own volition in over a year. Richard, frozen in mid-step, dropped his phone. "Outside?" Matthew nodded. "Just the garden, with Ariadne." Richard blinked. "You hate the garden?" "I want to see it again with her." So it was done. Caretakers rolled his chair down the hallway, through the expansive marble foyer, and out onto the winding stone path that led to the east garden. The sun was warm. Flowers were in bloom, roses, marigolds, lilies, and the breeze brought the scent of jasmine from the far hedges. Ariadne walked beside him, humming softly, her hands clasped behind her back. "You know," she said, "every flower here had to break through the dirt before it could reach the sun." Matthew looked at her. "You're obsessed with metaphors." "I have to be," she smiled. "They're the only poetry I can afford." He laughed. Not forced, not mechanical. A true, startled sound that made the birds scatter. Richard, watching from the window, pressed a hand to his chest. For a moment he couldn't breathe. That afternoon, Ariadne found herself in the library, alone. She wasn't supposed to be there. The Bennetts' private library was off limits. But the door had been slightly open, and something had drawn her in. Dusty volumes lined the shelves, and she ran her fingers across the spines as though they were relics from a forgotten age. One book caught her attention. It was leather-bound, with the title faded into a deep brown. She pulled it out. It was a journal. Curious, she opened it. The first page stopped her cold. "To Matthew, my greatest joy. If you ever read this, know that you are stronger than your father believes, and gentler than the world deserves." It was his mother's handwriting. Ariadne flipped through it, reading scattered entries. Letters, really. Letters from a mother to a son she feared would grow up without her. One entry read, "Don't become your father's mirror. Become your own light, even if it takes pain, even if it takes losing everything to find what truly matters." Tears blurred Ariadne's vision. She gently closed the book and returned it to the shelf. But the words clung to her like vines. Matthew had a legacy deeper than wealth, beyond paralysis. He had a mother who had seen something divine in him, a light his father had never been able to reach. Maybe that's why Ariadne had been drawn here. Maybe this was more than healing Matthew's body. Maybe it was about reviving his soul. 2 days later, Elijah arrived. He walked through the front doors like a gust of wind and brought with him a presence that felt both ancient and alive. Ariadne stood frozen when she saw him, tall, dark, eyes like molten gold. There was an agelessness to him, the kind that made you feel both seen and small. He smiled at her. "You've done well, child." She blinked. "You know me?" "I know why you're here." Matthew was wheeled into the sitting room. He stared at Elijah with narrowed eyes. "So you're the faith healer," he said. "I am," Elijah replied, bowing slightly. Matthew glanced at his father, then back at the man. "So what? You wave your hand and I'm fixed?" Elijah smiled gently. "I don't heal. I listen. I obey." "To what?" "To the one who made you." A hush fell over the room. Ariadne sat beside Matthew and reached for his hand. "Elijah doesn't pretend to be a magician," she whispered. "But he sees the wound under the wound." Matthew turned to her. "I'm scared." She squeezed his hand. So am I. But being scared doesn't mean we stop hoping. Elijah kneeled before Matthew. Do you believe, he asked softly, that God still writes new stories for broken pages? Matthew closed his eyes. For a long moment no one spoke. Then, barely audible, he whispered, Yes. Elijah placed a hand over Matthew's knees and began to pray. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was like water whispering over stone, gentle, relentless, eternal. Something shifted. A wind stirred through the room, though the windows were closed. The air itself felt heavy with something unspeakable. Then Matthew gasped. His legs twitched. Just once. A flicker. A tremor. Richard rushed forward. Did you see that? Ariadne's voice cracked. I did. Matthew stared down wide-eyed. I felt it. You really felt it. Elijah smiled, rising to his feet. It begins. Tears streamed down Richard's face as he fell to his knees beside his son. You felt something? Matt, you felt something? Matthew nodded, trembling. It's not fake. It's not hope playing tricks. I felt it, Dad. Richard reached for Ariadne's hand without thinking. He didn't care about class or image anymore. His pride had melted into the floor. Thank you, he whispered. Ariadne shook her head, her own eyes wet. Don't thank me. Just believe with him. That night, Ariadne stood in the garden alone. She stared at the stars, her arms folded tightly around herself. Mom, she whispered, it's happening. He felt something. It's like God's painting over the cracks. She paused, blinking back tears. But I don't know what happens next. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Behind her, Elijah's voice was soft. Be still. Let him lead. Ariadne turned. Do you think he'll walk again? Elijah smiled. The greater healing is already happening. Walking is just the echo. She stared at him, searching his eyes. Why me? Why send a beggar girl to heal a billionaire's son? Because God always sends the unexpected to break the impossible. Then he walked away, leaving her alone under a blanket of stars that suddenly didn't feel so distant anymore. The next morning, Matthew asked for crutches. The therapist was stunned. Richard was stunned. But Ariadne? She smiled like she'd seen this in a dream 1,000 times before.